Blackwood is a small village deep in a forest of streams, where fog often covers the narrow roads and old wooden houses. The people here live by hunting and farming. They do not believe in supernatural things. But recently, a strange thing has happened that makes everyone in the village feel uneasy. The story begins on a full moon night. Old Henry, an old hunter living in Lang Lang, notices that his dogs are showing unusual behavior. We are no longer as nervous as before, but become sharp and alert. Every night, when the sky is dark, the dogs gather in the cemetery behind the old church and begin to dig a specific area of land. At first, Henry thought they could judge the authenticity of the animal's vapor that is stirred in the ground, but their progress has been relentless for many days and their behavior has become more and more terrible. On the fourth night, Henry decided to go out to check. He took an old flashlight and walked slowly to the cemetery. It was pitch black, only the faint light of the moonlight on the windy gravestones. His dogs were still living in a frenzy, clawing at the mud as if there was something waiting to be declared underneath. Henry shivered, his intuition telling him that something was wrong. "Come on, enough," the big man, trying to pull the dogs out of there. But none of them would listen. We continued to dig deeper, soothing as if to warn something. Finally, when Henry lowered himself to look more closely, he discovered that the ground had been dug down about a meter, revealing a corner of the old coffin car, rotten by time. A cold air ran through the hunter's life. Someone had been buried here a long time ago, but the strange thing was that there was no tombstone, no sign that this was part of the main cemetery. He shined the flashlight down and looked more closely. The wood of the coffin was still intact, showing no signs of being completely destroyed like other ancient coffins. Henry took a step back, making a splash. At that moment, the pack of dogs suddenly stopped, turning their heads in unison to another direction in the cemetery. All of them were tall, their fur high up. In the darkness, Henry found a faint sound, like someone whispering, but couldn't tell where it came from. He felt his heart beat faster. Cold sweat began to form on his eyebrows. It was as if something invisible was watching him from the darkness. Henry quickly pulled the dog's leash, retreating towards his house. As he turned his back, a cold wind blew by, carrying a strange hissing sound from the cemetery. "That's not right. This isn't an ordinary one." The next morning, the story of the mysterious coffin quickly spread throughout the village. The people of Blackwood gathered around the cemetery, talking excitedly about what Henry had seen. The village chief, a man who had lived here for over 70 years, pondered for a long time before sighing softly. "I have never heard of a grave without a headstone. But if it really existed, it must have been filtered through centuries ago. Someone hid it here for some reason." A few curious young people insisted on digging up the coffin to find out the truth. However, the elders of the village were against it. They believed that something about the seal was not something that should be expressed. But the mystery had been discovered, and once discovered, it could not be ignored. The sky above Blackwood today was heavy with gray clouds, the wind whistling through the trees as if trying to warn of an impending disaster. The village seemed to be enveloped in an invisible anxiety. After the discovery of the coffin dug deep under the site, no one could rest easy. The old people whispered about the old legends, the young people tried to solve the mystery, and the middle-aged people just wanted to forget it and continue living as before. But the mystery had been discovered, and it could not be ignored. After a day of discussion, a group of young men from the village decided to return to the scene. They brought shovels, flashlights, and ropes, ready to completely excavate the coffin. Although still hesitant, the village chief agreed, but asked them to be careful and not to destroy anything carelessly. It was almost dark when the group arrived at the cemetery. The old tombs with moss-covered stone tablets looked like ghosts watching them. As the last rays of the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains, a cold wind blew, making everyone shiver. Henry's dogs no longer dared to come closer. They stood only a few dozen meters away, howling with terrifying noises. Finally, they finished digging. The coffin was completely exposed, lying in the middle of the ground. The wood was dark as if it had been burned by smoke. The carvings on the surface looked like ancient characters that no one understood. It was unlike any coffin they had ever seen before. "No name, no date," one of the group mumbled. "What the hell is going on?" One of the men, Jack, bravely stepped forward, using a crowbar to try to pry open the coffin lid. Everyone held their breath and watched. The creaking of wood echoed in the eerily silent space. When the lid was opened, cold air poured out from inside, as if opening the door to an ice cellar. And then, everyone fell silent. The man in the coffin was wearing old clothes, a style that did not belong to this era. But what was even more terrifying was that his eyes were still wide open, staring at the sky, as if he had never really died. In the dim light, the corpse's pale skin reflected an eerie blue-gray color, as if he had been buried alive in a state of unconsciousness. Suddenly, one of the group screamed. He pointed to the corpse's fingernails. They were strangely long, and there were scratches on the inside of the coffin lid. The village chief stepped forward, his eyes darkening as he saw the coffin. He knelt down, transfixed by the inscriptions on the lid. No one knew what they were, but he recognized them. The curse of the sealed ones. His voice trembled slightly. We shouldn't have opened this. This isn't a normal death. The remaining young men began to feel remorse. Some backed away, while others tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Jack swallowed, looking more closely at the body. A sudden thought flashed through his mind. Something was wrong with this body. Wait, he said, his hand shaking as he pointed at the body's wrist. Do you see? There's no sign of decomposition. Everyone was stunned. A body had been buried in the ground for years, maybe hundreds of years, without decomposing. And then suddenly the body's eyes moved slightly. Everyone recoiled, their hearts pounding. A cold breath poured out from the coffin, filling the air. The torches trembled, their light flickering as if moved by an invisible wind. Then a small whisper rang out. Give it back to me. Jack felt his whole body freeze. He turned to look at the village chief, but his eyes were wide open, his whole body trembling. He muttered something, then quickly backed away, his face as white as paper. Close the coffin, he shouted. Hurry, before it's too late. But it was too late. From deep within the forest, a cold wind blew. Henry's dogs howled in unison, as if signaling something terrible was about to happen. The candles placed on the grave began to burn fiercely, then went out in the blink of an eye. Suddenly, a bony hand reached out from the coffin. Jack screamed, trying to retreat, but something held his legs. An invisible force pulled him down to the cold ground. A heavy breathing sound came from inside the coffin, and then the body inside began to move for real. Its dry, cracked lips moved slightly, uttering the last words, I have returned. The group screamed in panic when they saw the body in the coffin move. Its dry, cracked lips moved slightly, exhaling a cold breath like from the dead. Its wide-open eyes, though cloudy, still shone with an eerie light that made everyone feel like they were being sucked into an endless abyss. Jack fell backwards, his hands trembling as he tried to retreat from the bony hand that was reaching out from the coffin. The long, sharp nails like animal claws dug into the wet ground, scratching a long, gruesome line. Oh my God, this can't be real, one of the young men stammered, his legs feeling weak. The village chief, the only one who understood what was happening, shouted, Close the coffin now. Do not look directly into his eyes. But it was too late. From the dead man's eyes, a dark stream erupted, creeping into the air like invisible tentacles. Those standing nearby felt their hearts slow down, their breathing become heavier, and their minds become dull as if hypnotized. A whisper echoed in their minds, light as the wind but haunting. You have awakened me, then prepare to pay the price. At that moment, a cold wind swept through the cemetery, carrying with it an eerie howl from afar. The candles before the gravestones all went out, leaving an absolute darkness, where the only light was the dim oil lamp that Henry was holding in his hand. The entire village of Blackwood seemed to be plunged into a deathly silence. Not a sound could be heard except for the hissing breaths from within the coffin. The village chief trembled and stepped back, his old eyes filled with absolute fear, an emotion no one had ever seen in him before. We have unsealed a demon, a cursed spirit from hundreds of years ago. Jack turned, his face pale, his voice almost lost. What do you mean? This isn't a normal person. The village chief closed his eyes, as if trying to gather all the buried memories of past. His voice was hoarse, trembling as if each word he spoke made him more terrified. More than 300 years ago, there was a man buried alive right under this land. But he wasn't a human. The group fell silent. They called him the Hollow Man. According to the village elders, centuries ago, a man mysteriously appeared in Blackwood. No one knew where he came from. No one knew his real name. He never slept, never ate, and never aged. He lived in seclusion, appearing only at sunset, wandering between houses with a hollow, haunted gaze. The village dogs howled whenever he passed, and small children cried, even though they had never seen him. People began to whisper that he was not human, that something had possessed him, an ancient and evil entity. Then mysterious deaths began to occur. Those who had looked him in the eye disappeared. Those who heard his whispers at night committed suicide in a strange way, their mouths still open as if trying to scream something before dying. Frightened, the villagers captured him, using ancient spells and rituals to seal him in a special coffin, buried deep underground with symbols that would block his evil spirit. But now, the village chief choked, his eyes lost. "We have awakened him." Jack tried to stand, but his legs were numb with fear. In front of him, darkness began to spread from the coffin, flowing into the ground like black snakes. Then, suddenly, a laugh rang out. "Ah, 300 years. I am finally free." Suddenly, one of the group Michael howled. His eyes rolled back, his body trembling before a sound that was not human came out of his throat. A gust of wind blew, and Michael was lifted into the air, his body contorted like a puppet being manipulated. From the darkness, two ghostly hands reached out, dragging Michael into the night. He screamed, then stopped abruptly. When the flashlight reached him, Michael was gone, leaving only a pool of blood on the cold ground. A gust of wind howled through the cemetery. The coffin door burst open completely. Night fell over Blackwood, heavy and oppressive like a giant shroud covering the entire village. The wind no longer whistled through the trees, no longer chirped insects in the woods, only a deathly silence. Those who witnessed the horrific event in the cemetery were still in shock. Michael was gone, pulled into the darkness by an invisible force, leaving only a dark trail of blood on the cold ground. But it was not over. Because when night came, the hollow man whispered. Jack Henry, the village chief, and the rest fled the cemetery in a panic. They locked their doors and lit fires in front of them to protect themselves from the evil that had just risen. But even inside the house, they felt like something was watching them. Jack sat back against the wall, his heart pounding. He felt those empty eyes still following him, even though they were no longer there. On his hands was still Michael's cold blood, the only trace left of his friend swallowed by the darkness. And then it began. Jack, a voice rang out right next to his ear. Jack froze, not daring to breathe. He turned around slowly, but there was no one. The room was still silent, the oil lamp flickering strangely, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But then the voice rang out again. "Jack, I see you." Jack jerked. This time, the voice was not a hallucination. It was there, hanging in the air, a cold whisper like fingernails scraping across glass. He wasn't the only one who heard it. In other houses, people began to hear the whisper too. It crept into the walls, echoed in their heads, as if the hollow man were speaking directly to their minds. People panicked. Some stuffed cotton in their ears, some sealed their rooms with wood, but no one could block it out. The whisper didn't come from outside. It came from within. At midnight, the village chief gathered all the survivors to the old church, the only place they believed they could stand against this evil force. Everyone huddled together, their faces filled with fear. "If you heard him, then you're marked," the chief said. The group was terrified. "He won't stop. He has been unsealed, and he will hunt us down one by one." A woman burst into tears. "So what? Do we have to run away?" The village chief shook his head. "No one can escape him. No one leaves Blackwood alive. Once he sees you, death is inevitable." Outside, the wind picked up again, but this time it carried a soft chuckle. Not human. Then, suddenly, someone screamed. A man in the village, Thomas, suddenly collapsed to the ground, clutching his head and screaming in pain. People rushed to his aid, but his eyes began to roll back, blood flowing from his ears. And then, his voice suddenly changed. It was no longer Thomas's voice. It was a hoarse, low voice, a voice that did not belong to this world. "You have awakened me, and you will never escape me." The whole church shook, the candles went out, and the church door swung open without anyone touching it. Darkness rushed in like a flood. The hollow man had entered. Darkness poured into the old church like an invisible flood, swallowing all the light. The candles on the altar went out, leaving only thin wisps of smoke floating in the cold air. The wooden door creaked open, even though no one had touched it. The hollow man had arrived. Thomas, who had just collapsed to the ground, began to tremble violently. His breathing was rapid, his eyes rolled back, his whole body convulsed as if he was being controlled by some force. Then suddenly, he jumped up, but it was no longer Thomas. A strange smile appeared on his pale face. His soulless eyes swept across the room, stopping at each person. "You should not have opened the coffin." A deep voice came from Thomas's mouth, but it was not his voice. The whole room froze. A woman screamed, but was immediately pushed to the ground by an invisible wind. Jack held the oil lamp tightly in his hand, his heart pounding. The village chief clenched the wooden cross, but he was also trembling. This can't be," one person stammered, his voice hoarse with fear. Then Thomas turned his head to look at each person, and his smile gradually disappeared. Those who opened the coffin must disappear. As soon as he finished speaking, the oil lamp immediately went out, and the whole church was plunged into absolute darkness. When the light returned, two of the group were gone. Jack turned his head to look around, his breath caught. Henry whispered, "What the hell just happened?" There was no trace of a struggle. No screams. They just disappeared, as if erased from this world. The others panicked. They huddled together, searching in vain. But the church was still locked. No one could leave, no one could enter. The village chief paled. He started. Jack turned around. "Eh? Who? You know what's going on, right?" The village chief was silent, his eyes drawn to a terrifying memory. The hollow man doesn't kill. He erases them. The group looked at him in unison, stunned. "Erase?" Henry whispered. "Yes." The village chief nodded, his old eyes flashing with horror. "Those he chose will disappear, not only from this world, but from our memories." His words sent shivers down everyone's spine. Jack hurriedly said, "We still remember them, which means they still exist." But when he turned to Henry, Henry was frowning, his eyes lost. "Remember who?" Henry asked. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He turned to the others, but everyone had the same confused expression. No one remembered the two people who had just disappeared. Their names, their faces, all were erased from the memories of the living. Jack backed away, his chest heaving with fear. What was happening? He still remembered them. He remembered them very clearly. But if he was the only one who remembered, then it meant the hollow man hadn't claimed him yet. And if that was true, he would be next. From deep within the forest, the wind picked up again, carrying with it a chilling whisper. No one knew where it came from, but they all felt a growing fear in their hearts. Jack couldn't take it anymore. He rushed out of the church, ignoring the village chief's calls. He had to find a way to end this before everyone was wiped out. But as soon as he stepped out the door, the wind died down completely. The darkness shuddered. A voice spoke from behind him. "Your turn, Jack." Jack stood still, his breath caught in his throat. The voice was so close that it was as if someone had whispered in his ear. But when he turned around, there was no one there. There was only pitch-black darkness, filled with darkness and a chill that penetrated to the bone. The village of Blackwood was strangely silent. The oil lamps in the church still flickered, but their light was no longer as bright as before, as if something was swallowing all the light. And then, in that chilling moment, a scream tore through the air. It was Alice. She was only 9 years old, the daughter of a family in the village, the only one who had had prophetic dreams since birth about things no one could explain. But tonight, her dream was no longer a premonition, but a real nightmare. Alice woke up in her small house with a start. But when she opened her eyes, her room was no longer her bedroom. It was gone. Alice found herself standing in a dark forest, a thick fog hanging over her like an invisible curtain. She tried to call out to her parents, but her voice made no sound. Then something moved in the darkness. Alice strained her eyes, trying to make out its shape, and at that moment, she knew she had made a mistake. A tall, thin shadow stood in the middle of the forest, just a few meters away from her. There were no eyes, no mouth, no face, just a hollow head. And as it moved towards her, a whisper rang out. "I see you, Alice." Alice screamed, trying to run, but her feet were glued to the ground. The shadow reached out, its fingers long and sharp as claws, touching her cheek. A cold feeling pierced Alice's mind. And then she saw everything. In that moment, Alice was no longer herself. Her mind was drawn into another dimension, where images flickered like an old, broken film. She saw Blackwood from hundreds of years ago. She saw the black-cloaked figures gathering in the darkness, whispering curses. She saw the hollow man, bound to a coffin with silver chains, screaming in despair as he was buried alive. They sealed me away, his voice echoed in Alice's head. But now I am free. Alice felt her whole body tremble. And you will be the first to know. Then she saw one last thing, an image of herself, lying on the bed, with two bony hands clasping her throat. Alice screamed, and she woke up. Alice sat up in bed, cold sweat pouring down her body. She gasped, trying to regain her composure. But then she sensed something was wrong. The room was still as dark as ever. But something was wrong. Alice froze. Her window was open. She didn't remember opening it. A cold wind blew in, carrying with it a soft whisper. You saw me, Alice. Alice didn't dare turn around. But she sensed. Someone was standing right behind her. Alice didn't dare breathe. She sensed a terrifying presence right behind her, something not of this world. She shivered, eyes wide, staring at the window as it swayed in the wind. The whisper was still there, echoing as if it were right inside her head. You saw me, Alice. She clutched the covers tightly, squeezing her eyes shut, praying it was just a nightmare. But then, the wooden floorboards creaked beneath her. Alice froze. Something was moving. Unable to bear it any longer, she let out a piercing scream, leaping from the bed and running out of the room. But as she ran down the stairs, her legs stopped. The front door was wide open. And outside, the Blackwood night seemed even darker than usual. Alice's scream woke the entire village. The villagers came running, looking anxiously at the trembling girl, trying to tell what they had seen. Jack and the chief were there at once, exchanging knowing glances. Alice had seen something that no one should have seen. The chief frowned, then turned to the elders of the village. It's time. No one said anything. But everyone knew they couldn't keep this secret forever. Under the flickering light of an oil lamp, a group of people headed towards the cemetery where the coffin had been dug up. But instead of stopping there, the village chief signaled for everyone to continue deeper into the forest, to a place that few people dared to set foot in. A cold wind blew, carrying the smell of damp earth and something even older than the village. Jack felt his heart beat faster as they stopped in front of a giant, moss-covered rock that looked like a part of nature. But when the village chief touched a strange symbol on the rock, it vibrated slightly in an unusual way. Then a crack appeared. Everyone stepped back, a dark passage opening before them, a door to the underground. What's down there? Jack whispered, trying to stay calm. The chief didn't answer right away. But then he said, We'll find out soon enough. The light from the torches flickered as the group walked down the narrow passage, leading into an old, deep tunnel. The walls were carved with ancient symbols, drawings depicting an ancient ritual, a man buried alive, chains wrapped around his body, and shadows surrounding him. Alice bit her lip. This is the Hollow Man. The chief nodded slowly. We didn't just bury him. We buried the door to this underground hell. Jack was stunned. What? At the end of the tunnel, a giant stone door blocked the path. It wasn't just any door. On the door, the ancient symbols glowed red, as if something was trying to escape from the other side. Alice felt a chill as she listened closely. There was a loud banging sound from within. Something was awakening. The village chief placed his hand on the door, closed his eyes, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then he opened his eyes and said a sentence that made everyone freeze in fear. We're too late. The door was open. As soon as he finished speaking, a growl rang out from inside the stone door. The wind howling like a soul chained for centuries was screaming. The glowing symbols began to crack. The ground shook. And then a skeletal hand slowly emerged from the crack. A voice echoed throughout the ground. You cannot stop me anymore. Everyone froze as a skeletal hand emerged from the stone door, its fingers long and thin like the claws of a monster. The wind howled, carrying with it a musty, bloody smell, as if the door had been buried for centuries, and whatever was inside had never truly died. Jack felt his head spin. He could hear whispers in his head, words that did not belong to this world. I have waited for you. The whisper had no clear source. It did not come from the skeletal hand, but echoed directly in the minds of everyone standing there. The village chief quickly pulled out a talisman, pressing it tightly against the stone door, but it was no longer effective. The protective symbols were broken. Run, he shouted. But it was too late. Something pushed out from the door, not a shape, but a thick blackness, rolling out like a deep black smoke. Jack stepped back, his hand tightening on the hunting knife, but he knew it was useless. The blackness had no specific shape, but it was moving, crawling like a living thing, but also like a nightmare that could not be destroyed. The darkness spread. The torches immediately went out. Inside the tunnel, the darkness became absolute, no room for light to exist. And then a voice. No mouth, no form, just an empty, endless echo. You have broken the curse. Now I will take everything back. Henry shouted, but his voice was cut off immediately. Jack turned around, and Henry was no longer there. Not a sound, not a trace. He had disappeared completely. Alice burst into tears, hugging the village chief tightly. She could feel something moving in the darkness, but no one could see it. Jack realized something. This shadow didn't just kill people. It erased them. Those it touched didn't just die, they were erased. From reality, as if they had never existed. Run! Jack shouted, pulling Alice and the village chief back. The group rushed out of the tunnel, but the shadow wouldn't leave them alone. The darkness followed them, rolling like a black wave. It didn't need to move on its feet. It just swallowed up space, erasing everything in its path. Jack felt his whole body go cold, as if an invisible force was sucking his soul. The village chief suddenly pushed Alice towards Jack. Get her out of here. Jack was horrified. What about you? The chief didn't answer. He turned, pulled out an ancient silver dagger, and plunged it into his chest, using his own blood to draw a mark on the ground. I'll hold it for a while. Run! Jack gritted his teeth, grabbed Alice, and ran out of the tunnel as darkness rushed in, swallowing the chief before their eyes. Alice screamed, but Jack didn't dare stop. He ran through the forest, not daring to look back. When they reached the edge of the forest, Jack collapsed, gasping for breath. Alice burst into tears. Chief, Henry, everyone. Jack wanted to cry too, but he knew there was no time to grieve, because something more important had happened. The Hollow Man was no longer the only problem. The gates of hell had opened, and from now on, the nameless shadow had invaded this world. Jack collapsed to the wet ground, breathing heavily as the darkness of the forest receded. Alice was still shaking, her eyes red from what she had just witnessed. Everything they had known had been erased in a single night. The village chief was dead. Henry was gone, and now only the two of them remained. Jack turned his head to look into the deep forest, where the gates of hell had opened, where the nameless shadow had escaped and was flooding the world. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. But before Jack could think further, a deep voice spoke from behind him. You have touched something you shouldn't have. Jack jerked, turning around immediately, drawing his knife and taking a defensive stance. Alice clung to his shirt, her eyes filled with terror as the man emerged from darkness. He stood at the edge of the forest, a tall figure, wearing a long black cloak, his face hidden in the darkness, revealing only a cold gaze like a knife. Even without clear light, Jack felt the gaze was piercing his soul, as if this man knew everything, had witnessed everything long ago. Who was he? Why did he appear at this moment? Jack looked tensely at the man in front of him, his hand tightening on the knife. Who are you? He growled. The man did not answer immediately. He only took a step forward, his eyes still fixed on Jack. Then he spoke, his voice deep and hoarse like someone who had lived through centuries. You have awakened something that should have been buried forever. Jack swallowed. Alice clutched his hand, whispering, Jack, I don't like this person. Jack did not reply. He only felt a strange coldness surrounding the man, a feeling that was not of this world, but not quite the same as the darkness that was engulfing the village of Blackwood. The man looked straight at Jack, then spoke slowly. You cannot destroy it. Jack was stunned. You know what it is? The man nodded. Then he said something that sent a chill down Jack's spine. The Hollow Man is just a small piece. The truly dangerous thing is the door you just opened. Jack felt his heart pounding in his chest. What do you mean? He pressed. The man's expression did not change, but his voice became colder and more serious. That door is not just a place to hold the hollow man. It is a seal of entities far worse than that. Jack was speechless. Alice whispered, trembling. You mean there are more like him? The man nodded slowly. More and more dangerous. And they're awakening. Jack clenched his fists, cold sweat running down his temples. They hadn't just awakened a demon. They'd awakened a nightmare. Jack looked straight at the mysterious man, trying to suppress the fear that was rising. So what do we do now? The man looked at him for a long moment, then slowly said, You can't kill them, but you can seal them. Jack was surprised. But how? The man didn't answer right away. He reached into his cloak and pulled out an old book, its black leather cover covered in dust from time. Everything you need is in here. Jack hesitated, but reached out and took the book. As soon as he touched it, a chill ran down his spine. Alice stared at the book, then whispered softly, I don't like it. Jack didn't like it either. But this was their only chance. The man stepped back, his eyes as sharp as knives, looking straight at Jack. You have two choices. One is to run, let the darkness consume everything. The other is to fight and seal away what you have unleashed. Jack didn't have to think long. He clutched the book in his hand, his eyes full of determination. I won't run. The man stared at him, then chuckled. Good. He turned, stepped into the shadows, and disappeared as if he had never been there. Jack looked down at the book, then up at Alice. We have a job to do. Alice nodded, her eyes still filled with fear, but also a little hope. The nightmare wasn't over. But this time, they wouldn't just run. Jack clutched the book in his hand, feeling the weight of fate on his shoulders. Alice stood beside him, her eyes filled with fear, but she did not back down. The gates of hell had opened, and if they did nothing, Blackwood would be erased. Jack took a deep breath, then opened the old book that the mysterious man had given him. The yellowed pages were covered with ancient characters, sealing spells from a long-forgotten era. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the book. You have chosen the hardest path. Alice was startled, holding Jack's hand tightly. Jack did not blink, skimming the pages, trying to understand what was going on. There was a special chapter in it, talking about the gates of hell and how to close them forever. But the price was not small. Jack gritted his teeth as he read the last lines. To close this door, a replacement is needed. A soul must be sealed inside forever. He clenched his fists, which meant if they wanted to stop the evil, one of them had to be sacrificed. One had to stay, to be consumed by the darkness. Jack turned to Alice. She hadn't read the words yet, but perhaps she sensed the truth. Jack, is there any other way? She asked, her voice trembling. Jack was silent for a long moment, then shook his head. Alice burst into tears. No, you can't do that. I don't want to lose you. Jack put down the book, knelt down, and placed his hands on her shoulders. Alice, if you don't do that, we'll have nothing left. Alice shook her head repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. We'll find another way. There must be another way. But Jack knew it was a lie. Before they could say anything more, the ground shook violently. From the forest, darkness poured out like a tsunami. The hollow man had returned. A huge black shadow poured out from the ground, its eyes hollow, soulless, but filled with endless hatred. His voice echoed in their heads, a hollow voice, lifeless, soulless. No one can seal me away again. The shadow lunged forward. Jack pushed Alice away, pulled out the silver knife the village chief had used, and charged straight at the shadow. But as soon as he touched it, Jack's entire body froze. He had no physical body. He was part of a nightmare, an entity not of this world. And now he was stronger than ever. Alice's eyes filled with tears, but then she saw the book on the ground. The characters were glowing. She picked it up, her hands shaking, but her eyes filled with determination. If someone had to be sealed, then why Jack? Jack was startled. But before he could react, Alice had opened the book, placed her hand on the last page, and read the sealing spell aloud. The words burst into a blinding light. The darkness screamed, trying to swallow them, but Alice continued reading, word by word. Jack panicked, trying to rush to pull her back, but an invisible force held him back. No, Alice, don't do it. But Alice just smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. I'm not afraid anymore, Jack. I'll protect everyone. Then she read the last sentence. A strong wind swept through Blackwood. The gates of hell shook violently. The shadow screamed one last time, then was sucked into the ground, taking everything around it with it. Jack screamed. Alice was lifted into the air, the light from the book surrounding her, pulling her towards the closing door. She smiled one last time, whispering, I won't be erased, Jack. I was just protecting you. Jack rushed forward, but at that moment, the door slammed shut. Alice was gone. Jack collapsed to the ground, his whole body shaking. Everything was quiet again. No more shadow, no more hollow man. The door to hell was sealed forever. But the price was too great. Jack looked around, desperately searching for Alice. But there was nothing. She was on the other side. A few days later, Jack stood on the hill, looking towards the Blackwood forest. No one in the village remembered what had happened. No one remembered Alice, except him. Jack clutched the book in his hand, his eyes cold but determined. Alice sacrificed herself to seal this door. But Jack knew. One day it might open again. And when it did, he would be ready.